So thanks very much for coming to listen. I hope you'll find this interesting. This is it's a book manuscript, and so I'm going to, I think I have 30 or 40 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes. So I'm going to have to cut some of it out. But if you're interested and want to see more details, just send me an email later, and I'll send you the manuscript. Happy to give it to anybody who is willing to take a look at it. So you can pour through the details or just ask me questions about it, about stuff that I skip over. So, right, the title is Inequality the Problem. This is what I'm going to try to answer as best I can. And I also should say that this project has a kind of a long history. I started out writing a book, something like this, in maybe 2008. Worked on it for a little while. Thought of co-writing it with somebody else, and an American sociologist, Christopher Jenks, we talked about it for a while. Both of us got busy doing other things, and then Sandy, as Christopher's known, decided he didn't want to pursue this any further. So I thought about writing it as a book on my own, but then gave that up because there was a lot of empirical research coming out at the time. This was by around 2013, 14. And I wasn't sure whatever conclusions I drew would last particularly long, so I set it aside as well. And now I've just come back to it. Not that we're at the end of the research trail here. Hopefully it's only really the beginning. But anyway, I want to try to tell you what I think about it. But let me start by telling you what the issue is, or the question or questions I'm trying to puzzle through. Just to be clear, I'm focusing here on the overall amount of inequality in society. It's not inequality between men and women or different racial or ethnic groups or native-born immigrants. It's things like the top 1% share of income and the Gini coefficient, how much overall distance is there in terms of income. And I'll say just a little bit about wealth later on because we just have far less data. Okay, so there's a long-standing ethical argument that says a lot of what determines where you or I end up in the income or wealth distribution is beyond our control. Therefore, the amount of inequality is somewhat arbitrary and unfair. It's a good reason to try to reduce it or at least keep it as a moderate level. I think this is a powerful argument. I think it's just as powerful today as it's ever been. But a lot of the debate about inequality reduction and how central it should be as a policy objective, how important it is as a policy goal, has now shifted toward another rationale, which is the hypothesis that especially income inequality, but maybe wealth inequality too, has harmful effects on a whole variety of other things that we value, that we want to achieve. I'm going to focus here on 5 of them, and I won't be able to go through the evidence for all of them. But so living standards, democracy, opportunity, longevity, or health more broadly, and happiness. I think these are the central ones, but you can sort of orient or organize these in a variety of ways. But this is how I'm thinking about it at the moment. I do think that the case for inequality reduction is much stronger if this hypothesis is correct, or particular elements of it are correct. And so a big part of what I'm trying to do in the book is sift through the evidence and see what I think about whether it is correct or not. I think in doing that, we have to look at countries, not only at countries, but we can't ignore the evidence from countries, because mostly what people mean when they offer this hypothesis, when they say income inequality is bad for health, for example, or bad for democracy, is that if my country has a higher level of income inequality than other similar countries, it's likely to have worse democracy or weaker democracy or poorer health or slower economic growth or less happiness or whatever the outcome is. Or that if income inequality gets higher over time in my country, then these outcomes are likely to worsen. It's also, I think, the case that the country is the unit where we have the most leverage in terms of policy to influence income inequality. It's not that nothing can be done at the subnational level or even at the neighborhood level or by individual persons, but mainly this is an issue at the level of countries if we're interested in the policy implications, which is really the key thing that I'm interested in here. So the analytical assessment is a means to reaching policy conclusions for me. It doesn't have to be for everybody. So I'm going to focus on 21 rich, long-standing democratic countries in the era for which we have the best data, and also when income inequality has been rising in most of them. So it starts roughly in the late 1970s, and I'm going to end in 2019 because it's right before COVID changes things. It's a nice, handy business cycle peak that's 40 years after this 1979 business cycle peak. So we've got good data. It's also the case that causal patterns are likely to be different in poor or middle-income countries. You see this, for example, with respect to economic growth. It's pretty well established now in the empirical literature that higher income inequality tends to reduce economic growth in middle-income and poor countries. But the main mechanisms through which this works are political instability and education. So lots of families keep their kids out of school to work. The country's really poor, the household's really poor. This just doesn't happen much in rich countries. And it's not been the case, at least not yet, even in this era of high and rising income inequality and high wealth inequality, that inequalities cause significant amounts of political instability to the point that it would reduce economic growth. So there are other outcomes and other hypotheses or other mechanisms, but this is an additional reason to just focus on rich democracies. We need two measures of income inequality. I'm just going to quickly show you these and explain why. So one, and maybe this is rehashing stuff that you're all very, very familiar with, but now very commonplace measure of income inequality is the share of income that goes to the top 1% in a country. These data come from tax records. Social scientists have now been assembling them. I mean, this is relatively recent, about the last 20 years or so, but social scientists have been getting access to income tax records and piecing this together. So we've got pretty good estimates for a number of these rich democratic countries going all the way back to the late 1800s. The pattern of income inequality in almost all of them is down for roughly 1910 or 1920 until around 1980 or so, and then up in most of them, but to varying degrees. A second type of measure is a Gini coefficient. So that first type of measure tells us about inequality between those at the kind of tip top and everybody else, which is important and interesting. A second kind of measure gives us more of a sense of income inequality within the rest of the society. In principle, it covers the entire society, but because these data come from public surveys, we often have so few people that are in the top 1% that we just exclude them, and in some countries we have none. So the common practice is to what we call top code these data. We just take out those with very high incomes. And so we end up with a measure roughly of inequality within the bottom 99 or 98, 97%. These data don't go back nearly as far in time, again, because they come from public surveys, and most of these countries didn't begin doing this until the 1950s, 1960s, sometimes into the 1980s. But for the few countries for which we have data prior to around 79 or 80, we see a drop, and then it begins to go up again, not in all countries and to varying degrees. But the two measures think, so some social scientists, the Congressional Budget Office in the United States has already been merging these two sources of data for about 40 years now, and some social scientists are beginning to do this for other countries. But this is pretty new, and it relies on a variety of assumptions and imputations. I don't think we have a good sense yet whether we can trust these merged data sets or the degree to which we can trust them. They're only available for a subset of these countries. And furthermore, when we look at the pattern of, so this is levels of inequality with the two measures on each of the axes here. So this is the bottom 99% Gini coefficient, so inequality within the bottom 99%. And this is the top 1% versus everybody else. These are averages over this 40-year period, and you can see there's a positive correlation between the two, so roughly the countries kind of fall in line. If you know where they are on one of the two measures, you can kind of predict where they'll end up on the other measure. But there are a number of countries for which the story differs a great deal depending on which measure you choose. So Think of Denmark over here, for example, which is one of the lowest on inequality within the bottom 99%, but very much in the middle of the pack for the top 1% versus everybody else. Canada and Australia, it matters a lot which measure you choose. South Korea, Finland, and so on. And things look even worse in terms of what using a unified or single measure when we get the data straight enough to be able to do that might lead us to overlook when we turn to change over time. So this is change in income inequality in the bottom 99% over this period, 79 to 2019, and then in the top 1%. And the countries are sprayed all over the diagram here. Again, there's kind of a correlation, but point is it matters a lot. All of this means simply that we need to use these two measures, at least for now. I'm going to show you some of the evidence where I'm focusing on the level of income inequality, but I'm going to favor evidence that comes from looking at changes over time and comparing that across countries. This kind of analysis gets us a little bit closer to an ideal experiment, which we obviously can't do when it comes to assessing the effects of income inequality on various outcomes at the level of countries. We're not going to assign different countries to move their inequality up or down and then see what happens. So comparing changes over time across the countries takes things like culture out of play to a greater degree than comparing levels. Again, I'm going to show you both. I think both are potentially informative, but we ought to prefer evidence that comes from the change over time, especially given that what we have in the data here suits this kind of quasi-experimental or difference in differences type of analysis pretty well. What we have is change in the hypothesized cause, income inequality. We got variation across our units in that change, so income inequality goes up a lot more in the United States, for example, than it does in other countries, but there's a lot of variation, as you saw from this chart here. And the change is mostly unidirectional, so this kind of analysis doesn't work all that well when countries are going up and down. If you think of the analog of analyzing the effect of a pharmaceutical in a purely experimental design, you wouldn't want to give people the new drug or the aspirin or whatever it is you're testing and then take it away and then give it again, take it away, give it again. What you want to do is divide your sample up into two groups, give some people the pharmaceutical, and then see how their whatever the outcome you're interested in changes or doesn't change over time depending on whether they got the so-called treatment or not. So anyway, the patterns in income inequality roughly fit what we need to lend some credence to this type of analysis. We've got a mostly unidirectional change in this period. We do have a fair amount of change, and we've got variation in that change across the units that we're interested in. Okay, and I also think this is one thing that we might worry about as well. It's probably going to take quite a while for the effects of income inequality to play out, depending on the outcome we're interested in. But 40 years, it's not necessarily going to be the case that we're going to see effects, but that's a fairly long period of time. And I think most of the ones that I'm looking at, it's reasonable to presume that if income inequality is going to have a noticeable effect, we'd see it in looking at a period covering 4 decades. I'm going to show you some very simple patterns in the data. I do a slightly more sophisticated set of analyses here, controlling for a variety of things, but I'm not going to make a big deal of it in this presentation, except in the rare case where it makes a difference. Okay, so let me start with living standards. I'm going to look at 4 indicators of living standards. And again, the idea here is to see if we find evidence that income inequality has mattered for these things, if it makes it worse, if it reduces economic growth or reduces absolute levels of incomes at the low end of the distribution or in the middle of the distribution, or if it changes household balance sheets. And I'm also not going to spend much time on the nature of the hypotheses here, but I'm happy to talk about that if you want at the end. So with respect to economic growth, this is one where there's been, I guess I'd say along with health and to some extent democracy, the most work, or at least I read the largest number of assertions that income inequality has detrimental effects, is on economic growth. But when we look across countries in terms of levels, it simply hasn't been the case that countries with higher levels of inequality have had slower economic growth during this period, nor has it been the case that countries with larger increases in income inequality have seen greater slowdowns in economic growth over the period. Growth has slowed down in most of these countries from the 80s and 90s to the 2000s and 2010s. This is the period looking at levels. Not the period, this is the picture looking at levels. This is the picture looking at changes. So I'm going to show you a bunch of these charts. In each case, income inequality, level or change is going to be on the horizontal axis. So this is the top 1% measure, will always be on the left. The inequality within the bottom 99% measure will always be on the right. And then the outcome measure, whether, again, levels, as in here, or changes, is going to be on the vertical axis. That's the same in both of the two charts. So the two charts on the screen only differ depending on which measure of income inequality I use. So no indication at all, and no matter what I try to control for here, I can't find the hypothesized negative association here between income inequality and economic growth, which, again, I'll just remind you, is contrary to what we see in the data for poor and middle income countries, where, again, there's a pretty robust finding now that income inequality is bad for economic growth, but not in the rich countries in this most recent era. Okay, what about low-end incomes? This is a sort of stand-in for poverty, but it's an absolute type of measure here. So it's just incomes at the 10th percentile of the income distribution and looking at absolute levels. For levels, yeah, I'm going to show you a bit of the correlation that's hypothesized. But when you introduce a few controls, it's easy to get rid of that. And I think more importantly, when we look at changes, we just don't see it. So this is the hypothesized negative correlation. Countries with higher levels of income inequality, like the US, Spain, Italy, the UK, tend to have lower levels of incomes at the bottom of the distribution. It's easy to see why this might happen. So more of the money is going to those at the top. Not only relative poverty, but absolute poverty is likely to be greater because there's less income at the bottom. But again, this could easily be due to other features of the society, the economy, and it's pretty easy to get rid of that negative correlation. And when we look at change over time, and again, it's, I think, quite reasonable to look at this because we'd expect that countries in which income inequality is going up more will end up with less rapid advances. There are increases in almost all these countries in the level of household income at the 10th percentile. But we'd expect slower increases as income inequality is increasing. And we just don't see that here. Same story with middle class incomes. I guess I'll pause just for a second and tell you that so this might seem really puzzling that we don't see this association. I think the story is essentially this. When we're looking at the bottom of the income distribution, a good chunk of households there get most of their income from government transfers or government-related income sources. And so the degree of increase in income over time at the low end of the distribution tends to be largely a policy choice. Sometimes that's through policies that are put in place to automatically increase or not over time, and that depends on how the economy goes. But basically, rather than, or to a much greater extent than absolute income levels for those at the bottom being determined by relative incomes, that is to say by income inequality, they're determined by policy choices, and those seem to have been largely independent of income inequality. You can imagine a situation where income inequality affects transfers going to the poor through the political process, and I'll talk about that in just a second, but it doesn't seem to have been systematically the case across these countries. So we don't see it with middle class incomes either. Indeed, this is in the opposite direction of what we'd expect, although there's really nothing there when you dig a little deeper. And again, for changes over time, we don't see any noteworthy correlation across the countries between changes in inequality, changes in median household incomes. And then lastly, household balance sheets. There are a couple hypotheses here about how when there's higher income inequality, that means lower incomes for people in the middle class or the poor, so they have to borrow more. So their net saving is lower, and that's the measure I'm going to use here. There's also a positional goods story, which says that housing especially, which is one of our biggest, well, for most people, far and away our biggest expenditure, our perception or satisfaction with our house determines not on the absolute nature of the house, but how it looks compared to our reference group. And so as the rich, whether it's the 1% or maybe the top 20%, as they get more and more of the income, they buy bigger and bigger houses, or they expand their houses. That leads the middle class and those below to try to emulate this. The only way they can do it is by borrowing more money, so that again reduces net household saving. Very plausible hypotheses. We don't see any support for it comparing it across countries in the data. Okay, let me, I think I'll just tell you the story for democracy and then quickly summarize the story for the other three outcomes here. For democracy, it's in effect impossible to do these kind of quantitative cross-country comparisons because the relevant measure, and by the way, I should also say that the core hypothesis here is not that income inequality is going to lead to the end of democracy in these rich, long-standing democratic countries. I mean, there is concern about that. First and foremost, I think in my own country, where in, I don't know, 7 months or so, we're going to have an election which could have some not so great implications depending on how it turns out. But the argument is more about a particular understanding of democracy, which is equality of political opportunity. So every citizen, every individual of voting age has, roughly speaking, equal opportunity to influence policy outcomes. We don't expect actual equality in influence because people choose not to vote. They may do other things or not do other things, but the opportunity we expect to be equal. And so the way to really try to measure this is as systematically as possible. Unfortunately, this has only been done by a handful of studies in a handful of countries. The best way social scientists have figured out to do this so far is to look at public opinion surveys on a wide range of issues, see what the average opinion is of people at various income levels, and then see how that tracks with subsequent policy changes. So the first really big version of this study is done by Martin Gilens, a political scientist in the United States, who with a team of researchers went back and looked at huge numbers of public opinion studies on as I said, a whole range of issues, and then divided the income distribution, because we're talking about surveys with maybe 1,000 to 2,000 people, into just three groups to represent the income distribution. So high income, middle income, low income. And then they saw how policy changes, and they looked at the subsequent 5 years, corresponded or didn't correspond to the expressed views of people at the high income level, the median income levels, or middle income levels, and low income levels. And it turned out, not surprisingly, that they correlate more with the views of those at the top of the income distribution than those of the middle. There wasn't a whole lot of difference between the middle and the bottom. It was mostly between the top and the rest of the population. So very good reasons to think that because money has a potential impact in politics through campaign contributions, lobbying, funding, media support, all kinds of ways. Being rich yourself, this is increasingly important in American politics. So lots of ways to think that money might matter. So there's very good reason to expect that as income inequality increases, you would move toward less equality of political influence. And again, we're inferring opportunity for influence from measured actual influence in the same way we tend to do with equality of economic opportunity, which I can say more about later. The thing is, we don't have really good data of the type that I just described over time, even for the United States, where more of this research has been done than anywhere else, or over a number of other countries. There are about 5 or 6 countries where Martin Gilens type analysis has now been done, and this is beginning to expand. So 5, 10 years from now, maybe even just a couple of years from now, it might be possible to do that kind of analysis. But right now we can't. So what I do for this outcome is really sort of closely explore the American case, which is the one we have the highest level of income inequality, the largest increase in inequality during this time period. A lot of good data on other indicators that might give us some information about the effect of income inequality on equality of political influence. And so I looked through a variety of indicators here. This first one, do higher income Americans have more influence on policy decisions than those with middle or lower incomes? I just told you the answer is yes. We know that from Gillen's study and a couple of other ones that weren't quite as systematic. However, we'd also expect this inequality of political influence to go up during the last 40 years of rising income inequality in the United States. And Gillen's data, which are limited, they don't cover this whole period, but for the period that they do cover, the answer, surprisingly, is no. There doesn't seem to be any more inequality of political influence in recent years than there was back in the 1980s and early to mid-1990s. Is the gap, as best we can tell, in political influence between the rich and the rest, larger in the U.S. with its higher inequality than in nations with less inequality? No. We know that, we kind of know that from a study by Larry Bartels and one or two others. Bartels looked at public opinion data just for social policy, so it was a sort of a narrow window, only one area of policy, but he found inequality of influence in European countries that more or less mirrored what we see in the United States. Have the kinds of things that the rich will tend to want if they have more political influence, have we seen them better able to get what they want in these areas in recent decades in the U.S. than in earlier decades? No. Top-end tax rates have gone down, financial regulation has decreased, and unionization's decreased, but no more rapidly, in fact, depending on the way you think about this, maybe less rapidly in the 2010s and 2000s than they did in the 1980s and 1990s. So, for example, the huge change in tax rates in the United States occurs in 1981 and 86, right at the beginning of this period of rising income inequality. Does the party that favors reducing tax rates and doing other things that will benefit the rich tend to get more campaign money than the other party? We only have two major parties in the United States. And consequently win more elections in the last 40 years? No, that hasn't happened. In fact, the Democratic Party has gotten the larger share of the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections, despite our massively high and rising income inequality. Does policy in the U.S. states with greater income inequality conform more to the preferences of the rich? Again, no. The states in the U.S. with the highest income inequality are California, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, some of the states that are furthest to the left in terms of their policy outcomes. And I'm going to skip over this. I'll say a little bit more about it later if you want, but for the sake of time, I want to make sure I get to my punchline. So my conclusion in terms of what I think we know about this question, does income inequality harm, is it harmful for democracy in the context of a rich, long-standing democratic country, is roughly the following. Yes, it contributes to inequality of political influence. Not surprising, and I think we know that from reasonably good evidence. But in terms of policy implications, it looks very much to me, based on what I can infer from the American case, that if we were to somehow magically go all the way back to the level of income, we in the United States were able to go back to the level of income inequality that existed in the late 1970s or maybe early 1980s, I don't see any evidence that should make us think that we'd get less inequality of political influence, that things would change at all in the direction that this hypothesis tends to presume. Okay, let me just leave that there and then just say I'm going to skip over the evidence for opportunity and for health. I'm happy to come back to this if you want, and also for happiness. Yeah. And so let me quickly say something about a few other things I look at in this book manuscript. So again, my real interest here is to think about what place inequality reduction should have in a policy strategy for a rich democratic country now in 2024. One of the things, in addition to answers to that question, is income inequality harmful, that's relevant here is, do people want less inequality? And so I'll just quickly say the public opinion data suggests yes, and they generally are supportive of government efforts to do this, but it also doesn't seem to be a top of the agenda policy concern. So when open-ended questions are asked, for example, about what are the biggest problems facing the country, income inequality is almost never very high up the list or included by very many people. Here, when it comes to the rest of the world, so all of the discussion here, almost all of the hypotheses and the analysis that I've just showed you and skimmed over a bunch of other ones, they focus on within-country inequality. If you care about income inequality, you might also be interested in inequality all across the globe. And here I just want to say, and I'll come back to this in a second, this is difficult to measure. We don't have any direct measures because many countries don't have the public opinion survey data or good income tax records that allow us to measure inequality directly. So mostly what researchers do is use those data where they're available and then use GDP per capita as an estimate or a guesstimate of incomes within a country. And so they put these two together. The best efforts, I think the best efforts here suggest a pretty sharp drop in income inequality worldwide in the last 20 years. So we want to keep that in mind. I want to say two quick things about wealth. We have far less data here. The two things I want to say is, if wealth inequality leads to a variety of other bad outcomes, we need to think carefully about why it is that some of the countries that I think many of us think end up with better outcomes compared to others, like Netherlands, but especially Denmark, Sweden, to an extent Austria, Norway, are among countries with higher levels of wealth inequality. They're not at the level of my own country, the United States, but they have fairly high inequality. One country for which we've got long-run estimates on wealth inequality is France. This is a measure of the share of wealth that goes to the bottom 50% of the population. It's one way of thinking about wealth inequality, one way of measuring wealth inequality. If wealth inequality is really harmful for lots of other things we care about, I think this picture, where we see that the bottom 50% of French households have hovered around 3, 4, 5% of wealth for 200 years, should make us think that, well, things have been pretty bad for the bottom half of the French population in a lot of other measures. But almost every other indicator we have, I think, suggests exactly the opposite. Things like economic security, opportunity, income, health, education, housing, all these things have improved massively for the bottom half of the French population over the last 200 years. So we ought to puzzle through what this implies for our contention or the hypothesis that wealth inequality is bad. Okay, so this is my core conclusion. I'm very much in favor of reducing income inequality and wealth inequality, especially in my own country where it's so absurdly high. But I don't think it should be at the top of the policy agenda. I especially do not think, based on what evidence we have, that we should think of income inequality as a core way to address other problems that we have with respect to living standards or democracy or equality of opportunity or health, especially longevity, or happiness or life satisfaction. At the very least, we shouldn't presume that reducing income or wealth inequality is going to get us a lot of traction in dealing with these other goals. I think we should focus much more heavily on raising the floor for those who think a lot about poverty and inequality and which one to prioritize, if either. This might not be particularly controversial. But I also, I guess, want to say, and here too, this comes from my thinking a lot about, especially the Nordic countries, but some other European countries too, but then also a little bit about cross-place differences within the United States. In a society where a lot of the core things that affect our well-being and our opportunity in life, where they're more or less assured in a decent way by government, it's just not clear that inequality is a big deal. There have been generations of Wallenbergs in Sweden holding on to huge quantities of wealth, and nobody's particularly upset about this. That's an exaggeration. Not many people are particularly upset about this because the quality of life otherwise in Sweden is pretty good. It's far from perfect. There are plenty of problems in that society. But the point is, if you can do a lot of the basic stuff, income and wealth inequality seem to become significantly less important. If we measured or counted as income the value of public goods and services that come to people, and some social scientists are beginning to try to do this, measured income inequality would look significantly lower. How much lower depends on the particular estimate, and they differ, but somewhere between a fifth and a third. Inequality in the bottom half of the distribution decreases by roughly about half if we were to do this. We ought to keep this in mind. Raising the floor through provision of public services and public goods reduces inequality of lived experience, even if that doesn't show up in Gini coefficients or top 1% income shares. As I said a few moments ago, I'm very much in favor of income inequality reduction, but mainly because of that old moral argument that used to be the main argument until, I would say, the last 2 decades or 25 years maybe. And then the very last thing I'll say, and I apologize, I'm slightly over time here, is just to elaborate a little bit about what exactly I mean when I say I think income inequality should be a secondary goal. Where here's maybe a slightly trivial example. So we ought to have more headline indicators than GDP growth and the stock market value and occasionally the unemployment rate or the inflation rate. But if I had to make a list of my top 10, probably even my top 15, income and wealth inequality wouldn't make the list. Maybe they would be 16th or 13th. And maybe for some people that says, okay, so my top line, my headline includes 20 items. I think that's really hard for citizens to get their heads around. I mean, this is a bigger debate. But I would say income inequality probably shouldn't be one of our headline indicators. Robert Shiller, an American financial economist, a couple of decades ago, pointed out that if we were really serious about holding income inequality at a lower level or reducing it, the technocratic aspect of this or challenge of this is not all that difficult. There's a bit of a lag, but we could just set an algorithm to adjust tax rates based on the top 1% share over the last 3 years or the last 6 months if we measure it more regularly, and then adjust tax rates until we get the level of income inequality we want. This is not a really hard problem to do. I wouldn't be in favor of doing this, nor am I in favor of, there are a couple of, I think, nice books that make good arguments, and this is a growing literature about whether we should have a maximum income or wealth level. Again, a bigger debate, but I don't think this would be a particularly good idea, but it would certainly help reduce income or wealth inequality. So would replacing public services, a variety of public services, with a basic income. Now, many proponents of basic income think we should just add it on, but if we think income inequality is so important, it would have really good effects on health and democracy and economic growth and so on, we could sidestep a lot of the political debate by saying we're not going to tax anymore, we're just going to switch the spending. So next year we drop the value or level of a bunch of public services and give people income instead. That would instantaneously reduce income inequality. And so if income inequality has all these beneficial effects, that might be a smart thing to do. I don't think it would be a good thing to do. I wouldn't make that choice. Let me skip over that. And just one last thing I'll say here. This is a little more tenuous, but I do think that it's relevant. So there's reason to presume that imports from poor or middle-income countries, especially for poor countries, and migration from poor countries is likely, all else equal, to increase income and or wealth inequality in a rich democratic country like the UK or the US. Maybe not a lot. This is disputed in the literature, but maybe somewhat. And so policymakers might be tempted to think, well, income inequality is really important or wealth inequality is really important. Let's reduce it. One way we could reduce it is by significantly reducing trade, imports, or migration. However, if you're a real egalitarian, again, you maybe should be interested in this. Arguably, trade and immigration are a significant part of the reason why this has gone down pretty significantly. A lot of this is driven by the growth in GDP in poor countries, especially China, but also India and a variety of others too. And so there may be a trade-off here between income and wealth inequality reduction in a rich democratic country and inequality reduction globally. And so I just want to point this out and make sure that egalitarians are cognizant of this and they're thinking about policy implications. Okay, let me just make sure I've forgotten here. Oh yeah, I have a few things to say about inequality, how to reduce inequality, but I want to stop there to leave time for questions, and I apologize, I've already gone over a little bit.